Okay. What needs to happen for a cell to reproduce? So one thing is we've got to replicate the DNA. Condense, and now why do we have to replicate the DNA?
We still need the copy. We still need the original copy.
Okay, so you've
cells.
got two cells now, and remember each cell contains the whole complement of DNA, the genome. So we have to copy that. We also have to condense the DNA. This is what happens during mitosis. So normally, if you look inside the nucleus, you won't be able to see the DNA. It's kind of unwound. And then, of course, you divide the two cells and copy with the DNA. We'll see how that happens during mitosis. So mostly, this is actually an electron micrograph of DNA inside the nucleus. It's usually only partly condensed. That's because, depending on what genes are being expressed at that time, those areas have to be open towards the biochemical reactions that are going on. Now, so to actually copy a cell, it's easier to get it to the point where it condenses completely, and these are called, you can actually then see the chromosomes. Okay, so these are chromosomes. They're homologous chromosomes. Homologous, homology. You guys remember what that means? Anybody?
They're made of the same.
Huh?
They're made of like the same.
Right, good. So we have homologous chromosomes. Okay. This is homologous chromosome. We've actually got two chromosomes stuck together at the centromere, right there. Now, one of these chromosomes is from mama, and the other one is from papa. Plus, there's been some crossing over. Okay, and then a chromosome, because it's homologous, we then have two sister chromatids. Again, okay. And as you can see, for most chromosomes, there's a long arm and a short arm. Okay. So the chromosomes are right here. This is the whole chromosome. These are individually sister chromatids, and then in the middle is the centromere that holds it all together. And then at the very end, we have centromeres. So these are the ends of the chromosomes. Centromeres tend to get shorter every time a cell replicates. And its telomeres have something to do with aging in general. So this is the cell division. Let's see here. Oh, okay. Let's let's see. A nice little diagram of what we just saw. Right here, of course, is G1. This is where we remain. Now, S phase is an interphase, and what's happening is, well, this whole thing is an interphase. S is where the DNA is copied. You need to copy it because now we're going to have two different cells. In the G3 phase, the cell has to grow, so each cell needs enough resources to actually split into two. Once it gets to a certain stage, then it starts going into mitosis. And we'll get into that in more detail. Now, there's there's a simulation exercise that's due, I guess, at the end of Sunday or something like that on mitosis. That's on Biol, so make sure you get that done. That will help you understand exactly what's going on in terms of mitosis. So during mitosis, there's a bunch of different phases. There's prophase, where the DNA is condensing, metaphase, where it all lines up along the mid-center of the dividing cell, anaphase, where it's being pulled apart to either side, and then cytokinesis. Okay? But we'll get into that specifically. But just so you know, there's a cell cycle like this. And this is really important. It turns out there's a whole bunch of checkpoints that make sure the cell is an okay cell. In other words, it's not starting to divide crazily like cancer does. So there's all these different checkpoints in G1, in S phase, in G2, and then during mitosis. And they're all this checking is part of the tumor suppressor system that our cells have. In fact, that all multicellular organisms have. Okay? So you could even, in a sense, there's some cells, let's say, that are single cell that they wouldn't need a tumor suppressor, but it's the same thing actually happens to them. And that's when they start uncontrollably growing and replicating. It's just that when you have it with a multicellular organism, that's when you have cancer. And instead of looking at the whole individual, me, you, a dog, a paramecium, algae, whatever, we actually look at the cell as the unit of selection. So in this case, with cancer, I'm just going to reiterate this again, but just so you know, if you think of each cell as an individual in a population of cells, if one cell starts to go haywire and starts reproducing uncontrollably, which is what cancer is, it's leaving more copies of itself. In other words, this is natural selection. You think, well, natural selection is supposed to make things better. Well, natural selection, whatever favors an individual, whether it's a whole organism, it's an individual cell, or it's a unit of DNA that's being copied crazily, selection can work on all those different phases. And so all that's really happening with cancer is that one cell has an advantage. Okay? It's got a selection advantage. It's leaving more copies of itself than all the other cells. So you would think, well, how doesn't this cell know it's going to end up killing itself? No, the cell just goes on and does whatever it does. There's no thought or anything or planning or seeing into the future with natural selection. It's a process. In this case, the process is there's a cell that's gone crazy and is dividing, leaving much more copies of itself compared to all the other cells. Those copies eventually form a mass. It needs resources too, so it starts producing or causing its own blood system, capillaries to form, all that kind of stuff. Okay. Most of the time, our cells, like I said, spend time in G1. If a cell receives a signal to divide, then S phase. And then cell growth, and then mitosis. So, as I mentioned, a cell can stay in the G1 phase sometimes for the whole life of your whole life. Others get turned over quite rapidly. Okay, what kind of signals tell a cell to divide? Can you guys think of anything? Okay, well, there's going to be some enzymes, but let's think about kind of gross anatomy. Huh? Huh?
If you scrape yourself?
Huh?
If you scrape yourself?
Ah, yes, exactly. So, one reason that cells divide is because you've damaged some cells. Okay, that's one. Let's see. Again, some cells need to be replaced. So, replacement of cells, whether it's because of damage or just the normal cell cycle. And then this, injury and cells wear out. Okay, and so they have to be replaced. And then during development, so this is developing from a single fertilized egg all the way through to an adult. Okay, and during that time, there's all these cells that are being turned on and then turned off. So once you have, let's say, the whole body plan laid out, for vertebrates with 4 legs, you've got 4 limbs, you've got a head region, you've got the nervous system developing, you've got the gut developing, everything is being developed. Eventually you have a baby that's born, and by this time a lot of the genes that are controlling all these different divisions and cell differentiations into different cell types, those genes then turn off. In fact, once they turn off, they don't come back on again. They're called Hox genes. And then, of course, cells have different lifespans. Epithelial, that's actually skin, is days. Blood cells, months. Muscle cells and cells of organs, years, and neurons, almost never. And then there's other signals. They're lonely. Sometimes cells get lonely, just like we get lonely. They want little brothers and sisters. Well, they want copies of themselves. And when this happens without control, they go rogue and cause cancer. Now, I mentioned there's a tumor suppressor system. There's a bunch of different genes that control this, like BRCA1, which is the one where if you have a mutation, women are much more prone to get breast cancer. Let's see, P51 gene that regulates, what it does is if it finds a cell or determines that it's, yes. What's that? Random? No, usually what happens is cells get mutations. Now, I'm not talking about germline mutations. I'm talking about just every time cells divide, something wrong can happen. You can get mutations. Now, normally, a couple of mutations aren't going to really affect things, but sometimes they will. And if you get enough mutations of the right type, it will basically turn the cell into a cancerous cell. And in terms of how aggressive it is, depends on the cell and the mutations that it has. Now, this tumor suppressor system, I mentioned these different checkpoints in terms of the cell cycle. All these checkpoints are designed to stop things, to check everything out, everything's okay, and then if it's not okay, like the P51 system causes the cells to actually die. So the cells commit suicide, it's called apoptosis. So, in fact, probably many of our cells start dividing like crazy, but the tumor suppressor system stops it from going on very far. At the slightest hint of your immune system checking some of these things out, if they find that a cell is acting a little, dicey, then it'll say, I'm sorry, you gotta go. It makes the cell commit suicide. Okay? So it is random in the sense of random mutations happen. The mutations, usually before a cell becomes cancerous, there are many mutations that need to happen. Now, some mutations will happen and just kill the cell right off. And others will not have much effect at all. And then some will have probably small effects. And you have enough with small effects, then you have a problem. Okay. Anybody know what oncology is?
The study of cancer.
Study of cancer and the treatment of cancer. Okay. Now, it says here there are genes that promote cell division, and they're called proto-oncogenes. Well, it's like it's saying, oh, these are the genes that are going to cause cancer. It's not exactly that way. If you have mutations in these genes, then you have a good chance of getting cancer. But there are really this was what the terminology they came out with years and years ago before they actually understood what was going on. So most genes operate perfectly naturally. They do what they're supposed to do. They're dialed up to make more protein product. They're dialed down, all that kind of stuff. Now, it turns out that these, what they call proto-oncogenes, are usually genes that control cell growth. They're part of a myriad of tumor suppressor genes that basically ride herd so that there's some cells don't go rogue. It's kind of like, well, think about salud.
Thank you.
Think about what happens when we've got a whole bunch of people living in a place and someone goes crazy and starts killing people. Who do we send to go after them? Huh?
The cops.
The cops, okay. Tumor suppressor genes are like the cops. Now, if one of those tumor suppressor genes gets mutations in it and isn't doing its job, in other words, the cops are on the take, let's say, right? Then you've got a problem because your tumor suppressor, even if it's one cell that is happening, instead of being suppressed when it's supposed to, it starts dividing uncontrollably. So these oncogenes, we'll just call them tumor suppressor genes. If they get a mutation and they stop working, oftentimes that's what really starts cancer.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is cancer genetic Is there?
Yes, it can be genetic in terms of germline cells. Okay, so now remember, in terms of genetics, all this stuff is actually genetics. But in terms of being handed down from one generation to the next, you can have certain genes like the BRCA1 gene that makes women more susceptible to cancer. Well, you can have actually those, the wrong allele on that tumor suppressor that's actually passed on from one generation to the next. But in most cases, cancer is idiosyncratic. One cell, during cell division, you get mutations that happen. These mutations, that is, as this cell divides over time, start building up, and eventually you get to a point where the cell loses control and goes rogue. Okay, so that cell by itself has a whole bunch of mutations. If you actually look at a cancer cell and look at all the genes that are turned on or expressing and those that are turned off, you'll actually see a profile of gene expression that's aberrant or not the way it's supposed to be. In fact, a lot of cancer genes, they can actually genotype the cancer and see which genes are actually being affected. And depending on which genes are turned off and on, certain drugs are going to work or they're not. So oftentimes we have, chemotherapy, therapeutic agents. Usually what they do is they mess with genetic pathways in terms of the oncogenes. If they're messed up, they target that pathway to stop it from happening. Okay, now that's targeted chemotherapy, not general chemotherapy, which is basically filling yourself full of poison, but it kills cancer cells faster than you. Okay, so that's why a lot of times you see people that actually get better from, let's say, colon cancer, and yet other people with colon cancer get worse, even with the same drugs, because the drugs are working on certain pathways, and if those pathways are not the ones that are in the other cell that are not affected, that this drug actually affects, then that cell will keep replicating. Okay, now, as I mentioned, cell differentiation, this is where cells early in development, like we have a blastocyst here. So here's our single zygote. Here's a blastocyst of a number of different cells. These cells divide and divide. As they divide, they differentiate into different cell types depending on whether they're part of the endoderm, mesoderm, or ectoderm. The ectoderm neural crest cells, they divide into, they're from the ectoderm. They divide into the neural system, for example. So mutiny is this perpetual problem for multicellular organisms. Literally every day in your tissues, there's a cell that breaks rank and sets out on its own. You might call it a grand explorer. And if it gathers a band about itself by copying itself, then suddenly, instead of having one cell who's off on its own, it's got a whole army of cells. So, look now, fortunately, I said this is going on all the time. Fortunately, we've got these tumor suppressor systems, and when a cell starts getting a little hinky, the police come along and take it away or make it commit suicide. Kind of like suicide by cop. Okay? Anybody going to be a pirate for Halloween? Horror matey? Okay. Anybody ever heard of the the spaghetti monster, the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster?
Yeah.
Okay, right. They've got, the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster has noodly appendages. It's a great god, okay? Now, it's a great god, I'm telling you. I mean, our God is always, like a person. Well, this guy's got noodly appendages. They can be made of rigatoni. They can be made of spaghetti. They can be made of, angel hair pasta. Okay, so there's different versions. Anyway, this is a society that is, well, you might say they question people who believe that God created everything, even though it's true, the Flying Spaghetti Monster created everything. Okay? A lot of people don't want to hear that. Anyway, I want you guys to look up the Flying Spaghetti Monster. You can all become adherents or disciples of the Flying Spaghetti Monster just by saying, I'm a member of the I believe in the Flying Spaghetti Monster. You don't have to sign anything, just so you know.
Are you dressing up for Halloween?
What?
Are you dressing up for Halloween?
I might be a pirate. Okay.
Are you going to ask us for money for the spaghetti god?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you have to leave tithing in terms of different kinds of sauce. Okay? In fact, there's been a schism in the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. There's been a number of schisms between like white sauce and red sauce. These groups don't talk to each other anymore. Okay? One believes the sacrament is a white sauce, preferably clam sauce. The other, a marinara sauce, let's say. Okay. Now, they believe in pirates, too. The Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, they're called pastafarians. Okay? Instead of Rastafarians. Pastafarians. Okay? And they also believe that pirates are their natural constituency. And so they love pirates. Now, the pirates that we see nowadays that are carrying out AK-47s, let's look down a little bit on them. But still, they're pirates. They steal, and they sell people into the slave market. So that's all good. Okay, enough of that. So you just might want to be a pirate for Halloween. And then you can see, being a pirate, it gives you all sorts of, it gives you permission to do bad things. You say, I'm sorry, I'm just a pirate, I can't help it. Right? That's what I do. So, being a pirate can be good unless you get caught. And then, of course, being a pirate can be bad. Okay. So when regulation, these tumor suppressor genes, for example, break down and don't stop cells from dividing uncontrollably, then we have unrestricted cell division, and it can lead to cancer. So this is a case where there's actually natural selection on individuals, and remember, populations evolve, but natural selection can work on individual cells. In other words, selection works on the individual, populations evolve, and populations of cells evolve. So, in a sense, cancer is, now, normally there's the selective environment for most cells is that they do what they're supposed to do in terms of the cell cycle. They don't go crazy and break ranks. In other words, there's things that stop them from going crazy. The tumor suppressor cells, genes, they actually make the cell commit suicide. Okay, so that's the police force, that's part of selection going on. But occasionally, those cells lose that police force, and they go off willy-nilly. So those are cells that start to divide uncontrollably. Not all of them turn into cancer. So multicellular organisms require teamwork to stop this from happening. And this system is called the tumor suppressor system, and there's a bunch of different genes that regulate it. Now, for the most part, the system cannot break down with one mutation. It takes many mutations. And occasionally, like we mentioned, some mutations are actually inherited from your parents, but every time all these other cells divide and stuff, you can actually get mutations that way as well, somatic cell. So somatic cells are the ones that are not, have to do with sex determination. Okay. So inheritance of one of these mutations is a head start towards accumulating enough mutations to get cancer. So we sometimes talk about chemicals that are, yes.
I'm sorry. Is it cumulative?
Yeah, so now, there are inherited forms of cancer. Let's say the BRCA gene is inherited. Okay, it's actually a tumor suppressor gene. So even that we've inherited this, and because of that, that gene, because it's not doing its job, gives a head start for cancer to develop.
For that type of cancer, right?
Yeah, exactly. Now, the BRCA gene works in a number of different cell types, okay? But it works primarily in certain cell types and not others. So I think the BRCA gene also controls, let's say, colon cancer as well, I'm not sure. Okay, yeah.
Can babies be born with cancer?
Yeah, occasionally that can happen. Yep.
Like cancers develop in
Yeah, yeah. Usually, cancer develops, for the most part, later in life. When the body starts decaying and breaking down, things aren't doing their jobs. The whole system kind of is not, it's like, I'll get to it tomorrow, something like that, right? And so it usually happens, you see people later in life, that's where most cancers develop. There are some cancers that develop during childhood, like you mentioned.
No, I mean like born, like once they...
No, once they actually, or even when they're still in the fetus, it can happen, yes.
You said cancer is caused by certain mutations, right?
Yeah.
Is there certain things that cause a mutation to happen?
So, there's different things. There are chemicals that are mutagens, okay? There are other chemicals that are, not only they're mutagens, but they're what are they called? Carcinogens, right? So like smoking a cigarette, have all sorts of chemicals in them, some of which are mutation causing, some of which are cancer causing, okay? They cause mutations. Radiation causes mutations in the DNA, okay? In fact, usually when there's, let's say, like Chernobyl, where a lot of people were exposed to, or Japan, where Fukushima, the reactor broke down, started spewing radiation. People's cells there got damaged, and you always expect to see a certain number of new, let's say, leukemias and different kinds of cancer. So that can cause cancer. Even chemicals, natural chemicals in your environment can cause cancer. There's these cyanide compounds that a lot of plants have to protect themselves, and they can actually cause cancer as well by causing breakdown in the way cells are expressed. Okay? So cancer is one of those things that happens, and all different kinds of things can cause cancer. Sometimes it's just a matter of the cell dividing during mitosis that you develop a mutation. Something is not, the DNA is not copied exactly right. So instead of having a C, you have a G. Okay?
One more question. You said there's, like in Fukushima, there would be a new type of leukemia?
No, there'd be, usually you start seeing leukemia, new leukemia cases.
Oh, okay, new cases.
Yes,
Okay, I thought you said
yeah.
like you meant a new type.
There are a number of different types. There are certain types that are associated with radiation.
Are
And then there's other types that are associated with a virus that causes some leukemia cases, yeah.
Are there some that have more research that better treatment?
Yeah, well, things are changing a lot now. In the past, cancer treatment was pretty, well, it's still not very good, but in certain areas, they've now got drugs that actually cure cancer. Like there's this chemotherapeutic agent called Gleevec that causes a blood type of cancer. I think it's a type of leukemia, okay? Because it's actually designed to go and interrupt the pathway that leads to, the biochemical pathway that leads to that type of leukemia.
So you kind of repopulate.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. And now those kinds of treatments are much better. First of all, they only affect the cancer cells and not any other cells. The trouble is that a lot of times, a lot of cancer cells, you start treating with an agent that works really well, but they keep continuing to generate new mutations, and eventually there's a new pathway that gets out of control, and so the therapeutic agents that was working no longer works. Okay? They've got a new thing that they're using now that you probably heard about, where they actually prime the immune system to recognize when cells go crazy. And so what they do is they get the immune system to recognize on the cell surface of a cancer cell, oh, if we see this, we generate antibodies, and then the immune system attacks it. This has been, like there's a new drug for melanoma, which is a skin cancer that is the only one that's really deadly. That works generally very well in terms of a subset of melanoma, where normally someone would be dead within, let's say, a year. They're still living after 5 years. Okay. And in fact, it looks like this kind of this immune therapy works better the more mutations the cell has. So if a cancer cell has many, many, many mutations, it's more likely to be recognized as deviant. Okay. Is it genetic? Yes, there are kinds of cancers that are genetic. A common one is a cancer of the eye. I think it might be on a sex chromosome, I'm not sure. But yeah, I think it is, because mainly boys get it. And so if you have a mutation in one copy, and it's you don't have a rescue from, since it's a sex cell, you don't have two complementary chromosomes. You have one from the mom, one from the father, X and Y. So occasionally, when that happens, then you oftentimes see this cancer develop, and they have to take the person's eye out. Yeah.
Is that rare? Because earlier you said it mostly happens in autosomal.
Yeah, that is rare.
Autosomes.
It's not a very common cancer. Retinoblastoma is what it's called. Okay, but it does happen, and unfortunately, if you get it, there's an indication, of course, that you've got the mutation that's been inherited, and there's a good chance you might lose the other eye as well. So it's kind of nasty.
You can transplant eyes though, right?
What?
You can transplant eyes now, right?
I don't think so. That you can do corneas and things like that, but I don't think they've ever actually transplanted an eye. Primarily because neuronal tissue. So the retina is part of, is actually part of the brain. And it's difficult to get those cells to grow after you've kind of cut the connection. Now, it can be environmental, like I mentioned. There's all sorts of chemicals out there that can cause mutations, that can cause cancer. Some are chemicals that we've created and mucked up the planet with, and then there's others that are just natural, nice sort of natural chemicals that everything is natural, so everything is good except that this will kill you. Okay. Is it contagious? Yes and no. Not for humans, but dogs get a kind of cancer that they can pass on from one animal to the next. Tasmanian devils in Australia, they've got a cancer. Now the ones with dogs, it usually doesn't kill them. The Tasmanian devils, it does. So Tasmanian devils at this point they might go extinct actually. So they developed the cancer, and it was actually able to be passed from one individual to the next. Mainly because during sex they bite each other a lot, and it looks like that's the method of transmission. Is cancer on the rise? I think some kinds of cancers probably are. There's, before industrialization with all these new chemicals, there were a lot of cancers that never happened because they're caused by specific kinds of chemicals, like benzene is a known carcinogen that's found in gasoline. Can your immune system protect you? Yes, and it usually does. Is the treatment worse than the disease? Sometimes.